Section 31 of the First Voyage of James Cook, Volume 1 by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 4, Part 2. The range from Mercury Bay to the Bay of Islands. An expedition up the River Thames. Some account of the Indians who inhabit its banks and the fine timber that grows there. Several interviews with the natives on different parts of the coast, and a skirmish with them upon an island. Continued. At noon, the mainland extended from south by east to northwest by west. A remarkable point of land bearing west distant 4 or 5 miles. At 3 we passed it, and I gave it the name of Cape Brett in honour of Sir Piercy. The land of this cape is considerably higher than any part of the adjacent coast. At the point of it is a high round hillock, and northeast by north, at a distance of about a mile, is a small high island or rock, which, like several that have already been described, was perforated quite through, so as to appear like the arch of a bridge. This cape, or at least some part of it, is by the natives called Motugogo, and it lies in latitude 35 degrees 10 minutes 30 seconds south, longitude 185 degrees 25 minutes west. On the west side of it is a large and pretty deep bay, lying in southwest by west, in which there appeared to be several small islands. The point that forms the northwest entrance lies west 1/4 north at the distance of 3 or 4 leagues from Cape Brett, and I distinguished it by the name of Point Pocock. On the west side of the bay we saw several villages, both upon islands and the main, and several very large canoes came off to us, full of people, who made a better appearance than any we had seen yet. They were all stout and well made. Their hair, which was black, was tied up in a bunch on the crown of their heads and stuffed with white feathers. In each of the canoes were 2 or 3 chiefs, whose habits were of the best sort of cloth and covered with dog skin, so as to make an agreeable appearance. Most of these people were marked with Yamoko, like those who had been alongside of us before. Their manner of trading was also equally fraudulent, and the officers neglecting either to punish or fright them, one of the midshipmen who had been defrauded in his bargain had recourse, for revenge, to an expedient which was equally ludicrous and severe. He got a fishing line, and when the man who had cheated him was close under the ship's side in his canoe, he heaved the lead with so good an aim that the hook caught him by the backside. He then pulled the line, and the man holding back, the hook broke in the shank, and the beard was left sticking in the flesh. During the course of this day, though we did not range more than 6 or 8 leagues of the coast, we had alongside and on board the ship between 400 and 500 of the natives, which is a proof that this part of the country is well inhabited. At 8 o'clock the next morning, we were within a mile of a group of islands which lie close under the main, at the distance of 22 miles from Cape Brett, in the direction of northwest by west to half-west. At this place, having but little wind, we lay about 2 hours, during which time several canoes came off and sold us some fish, which we called cavales, and for that reason I gave the same name to the islands. These people were very insolent, frequently threatening us, even while they were selling their fish, and when some more canoes came up, they began to pelt us with stones. Some small shot were then fired, and hit one of them while he had a stone in his hand, in the very action of throwing it into the ship. They did not, however, desist till some others had been wounded, and then they went away, and we stood off to sea. The wind being directly against us, we kept plying to windward till the 29th, when we had rather lost than gained ground. I therefore bore up for a bay which lies to the westward of Cape Brett. At this time it was about 2 leagues to leeward of us, and at about 11 o'clock we anchored under the southwest side of one of the many islands which line it on the southeast, in 4 fathom and a half water. We shoaled our water to this depth all at once, and if this had not happened, I should not have come to an anchor so soon. The master was immediately sent out with 2 boats to sound, and he soon discovered that we had got upon a bank which runs out of the northwest end of the island, and that on the outside of it there was from 8 to 10 fathom. In the meantime, the natives, to the number of near 400, crowded upon us in their canoes, and some of them were admitted on board. To one, who seemed to be a chief, I gave a piece of broadcloth, and distributed some trifling presents among the rest. I perceived that some of these people had been about the ship when she was off at sea, and that they knew the power of our firearms, for the very sight of a gun threw them into manifest confusion. Under this impression they traded very fairly. But the people in one of the canoes took the opportunity of our being at dinner to tow away our boy. A musket was fired over them without effect. We then endeavoured to reach them with some small shot, but they were too far off. By this time they had got the boy into their canoe, and we were obliged to fire a musket at them with ball. This hit one of them, and they immediately threw the boy overboard. A round shot was then fired over them, which struck the water and went ashore. 2 or 3 of the canoes immediately landed their people, who ran about the beach, as we imagined, in search of the ball. Tupia called to them and assured them that, while they were honest, they should be safe, and with a little persuasion many of them returned to the ship, and their behaviour was such as left us no reason to suspect that they intended to give us any farther trouble. After the ship was removed into deeper water and properly secured, I went with the pinnace and yawl, manned and armed, accompanied by Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander, and landed upon the island, which was about 3/4 of a mile distant. We observed that the canoes which were about the ship did not follow us upon our leaving her, which we thought a good sign. But we had no sooner landed than they crowded to different parts of the island and came on shore. We were in a little cove, and in a few minutes were surrounded by 200 or 300 people, some rushing from behind the heads of the cove, and others appearing on the tops of the hills. They were all armed, but they came on in so confused and straggling a manner that we scarcely suspected they meant us any harm, and we were determined that hostilities should not begin on our part. We marched towards them, and then drew a line upon the sand between them and us, which we gave them to understand they were not to pass. At first they continued quiet, but their weapons were held ready to strike, and they seemed to be rather irresolute than peaceable. While we remained in this state of suspense, another party of Indians came up, and now growing more bold as their number increased, they began the dance and song, which are their preludes to a battle. Still, however, they delayed the attack, but a party ran to each of our boats, and attempted to draw them on shore. This seemed to be the signal, for the people about us at the same time began to press in upon our line. Our situation was now become too critical for us to remain longer inactive. I therefore discharged my musket, which was loaded with small shot, at one of the forwardest, and Mr. Banks and two of the men fired immediately afterwards. This made them fall back in some confusion, but one of the chiefs, who was at the distance of about 20 yards, rallied them, and running forward, waving his patu and calling loudly to his companions, led them to the charge. Dr. Solander, whose piece was not yet discharged, fired at this champion, who stopped short upon feeling the shot, and then ran away with the rest. They did not, however, disperse, but got together upon a rising ground, and seemed only to want some leader of resolution to renew their attack. As they were now beyond the reach of small shot, we fired with ball, but as none of them took place, they still continued in a body, and in this situation we remained about a quarter of an hour. In the meantime the ship, from whence a much greater number of Indians were seen than could be discovered in our situation, brought her broadside to bear, and entirely dispersed them by firing a few shot over their heads. In this skirmish only two of the Indians were hurt with a small shot, and not a single life was lost, which would not have been the case if I had not restrained the men, who, either from fear or the love of mischief, showed as much impatience to destroy them as a sportsman to kill his game. When we were in quiet possession of our cove, we laid down our arms and began to gather celery, which grew here in great plenty. After a little time, we recollected to have seen some of the people hide themselves in a cave of one of the rocks. We therefore went towards the place, when an old Indian, who proved to be the chief that I had presented with a piece of broadcloth in the morning, came out with his wife and his brother, and in a supplicating posture put themselves under our protection. We spoke kindly to them, and the old man then told us that he had another brother, who was one of those that had been wounded by the small shot, and inquired, with much solicitude and concern, if he would die. We assured him that he would not, and at the same time put into his hand both a musket ball and some small shot, telling him that those only who were wounded with the ball would die, and that the others would recover, at the same time assuring him that if we were attacked again, we should certainly defend ourselves with a ball, which would wound them mortally. Having now taken courage, they came and sat down by us, and as tokens of our perfect amity, we made them presents of such trifles as we happened to have about us. Soon after we re-embarked in our boats, and having rowed to another cove in the same island, climbed a neighbouring hill, which commanded the country to a considerable distance. The prospect was very uncommon and romantic, consisting of innumerable islands, which formed as many harbours, where the water was as smooth as a mill pond. We saw also many towns, scattered houses, and plantations, the country being much more populous than any we had seen. One of the towns was very near us, from which many of the Indians advanced, taking great pains to show us that they were unarmed, and in their gestures and countenances expressing great meekness and humility. In the meantime, some of our people who, when the Indians were to be punished for a fraud, assumed the inexorable justice of a Lycurgus, thought fit to break into one of their plantations and dig up some potatoes. For this offence I ordered each of them to be punished with 12 lashes, after which 2 of them were discharged, but the third, insisting that it was no crime in an Englishman to plunder an Indian plantation, though it was a crime in an Indian to defraud an Englishman of a nail, I ordered him back into his confinement, from which I would not release him till he had received 6 lashes more. On the 30th, there being a dead calm, and no probability of our getting to sea, I sent the master with 2 boats to sound the harbour, and all the forenoon had several canoes about the ship, who traded in a very fair and friendly manner. In the evening we went ashore upon the Main, where the people received us very cordially, but we found nothing worthy of notice. In this bay we were detained by contrary winds and calms several days, during which time our intercourse with the natives was continued in the most peaceable and friendly manner, they being frequently about the ship and we ashore, both upon the islands and the Main. In one of our visits to the continent, an old man showed us the instrument they use in the staining their bodies, which exactly resembled those that were employed for the same purpose at Tahiti. We saw also the man who was wounded in attempting to steal our boy. The ball had passed through the fleshy part of his arm and grazed his breast, but the wound, under the care of nature, the best surgeon, and a simple diet the best nurse, was in a good state, and seemed to give the patient neither pain nor apprehension. We saw also the brother of our old chief, who had been wounded with small shot in our skirmish. They had struck his thigh obliquely, and though several of them were still in the flesh, the wound seemed to be attended with neither danger nor pain. We found among their plantations the Morus papyrifera, of which these people, as well as those of Tahiti, make cloth. But here the plant seems to be rare, and we saw no pieces of the cloth large enough for any use but to wear by way of ornament in their ears. Having one day landed in a very distant part of the bay, the people immediately fled, except one old man, who accompanied us wherever we went, and seemed much pleased with the little presents we made him. We came at last to a little fort built upon a small rock, which at high water was surrounded by the sea and accessible only by a ladder. We perceived that he eyed us with a kind of restless solicitude as we approached it, and upon our expressing a desire to enter it, he told us that his wife was there. He saw that our curiosity was not diminished by this intelligence, and after some hesitation, he said, if we would promise to offer no indecency, he would accompany us. Our promise was readily given, and he immediately led the way. The ladder consisted of steps fastened to a pole, but we found the ascent both difficult and dangerous. When we entered, we found 3 women who, the moment they saw us, burst into tears of terror and surprise. Some kind words and a few presents soon removed their apprehensions and put them into good humour. We examined the house of our old friend, and by his interest 2 others, which were all that the fortification contained, and having distributed a few more presents, we parted with mutual satisfaction. At 4 o'clock in the morning of the 5th of December, we weighed with a light breeze, but it being variable with frequent calms, we made little way. We kept turning out of the bay till the afternoon, and about 10 o'clock we were suddenly becalmed, so that the ship would neither wear nor stay, and the tide or current setting strong, she drove towards land so fast that before any measures could be taken for her security, she was within a cable's length of the breakers. We had 13-fathom water, but the ground was so foul that we did not dare to drop our anchor. The pinnace, therefore, was immediately hoisted out to take the ship in tow, and the men, sensible of their danger, exerting themselves to the utmost, and a faint breeze springing up off the land, we perceived, with unspeakable joy, that she made headway, after having been so near the shore that Tupia, who was not sensible of our hair's breadth escape, was at this very time conversing with the people upon the beach, whose voices were distinctly heard, notwithstanding the roar of the breakers. We now thought all danger was over, but about an hour afterwards, just as the man in the chains had cried 17 fathom, the ship struck. The shock threw us all into the utmost consternation. Mr. Banks, who had undressed himself and was stepping into bed, ran hastily up to the deck, and the man in the chains called out 5 fathom. By this time, the rock on which we had struck being to windward, the ship went off without having received the least damage, and the water very soon deepened to 20 fathom. This rock lies half a mile west-northwest of the northernmost or outermost island on the southeast side of the bay. We had light airs from the land with calms till 9 o'clock the next morning, when we got out of the bay, and a breeze springing up at north-northwest, we stood out to sea. This bay, as I have before observed, lies on the west side of Cape Brett, and I named it the Bay of Islands, from the great number of islands which line its shores, and from several harbours equally safe and commodious, where there is room and depth for any number of shipping. That in which we lay is on the southwest side of the southwesternmost island, called Matararo, on the southeast side of the bay. I have made no accurate survey of this bay, being discouraged by the time it would cost me. I thought also that it was sufficient to be able to affirm that it afforded us good anchorage and refreshment of every kind. It was not the season for roots, but we had plenty of fish, most of which, however, we purchased of the natives, for we could catch very little ourselves, either with net or line. When we showed the natives our seine, which is such as the king's ships are generally furnished with, they laughed at it, and in triumph produced their own, which was indeed of an enormous size, and made of a kind of grass, which is very strong. It was 5 fathom deep, and by the room it took up, it could not be less than 300 or 400 fathom long. Fishing seems indeed to be the chief business of life in this part of the country. We saw about all their towns a great number of nets, laid in heaps like haycocks, and covered with a thatch to keep them from the weather, and we scarcely entered a house where some of the people were not employed in making them. The fish we procured here were sharks, stingrays, sea bream, mullet, mackerel, and some others. The inhabitants in this bay are far more numerous than in any other part of the country that we had before visited. It did not appear to us that they were united under one head, and though their towns were fortified, they seemed to live together in perfect amity. It is high water in this bay at the full and change of the moon about 8 o'clock, and the tide then rises from 6 to 8 feet perpendicularly. It appears, from such observations as I was able to make of the tides upon the sea coast, that the flood comes from the southward, and I have reason to think that there is a current which comes from the westward, and sets along the shore to the southeast or south-southeast as the land happens to lie. End of section 31. Section 32 of the First Voyage of James Cook, Volume 1 by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 5. Range from the Bay of Islands round North Cape to Queen Charlotte Sound, and a description of that part of the coast. On Thursday, the 7th of December, at noon, Cape Brett bore south-southeast a half east, distant 10 miles, and our latitude, by observation, was 34 degrees 59 minutes south. Soon after, we made several observations of the sun and moon, the result of which made our longitude 185 degrees 36 minutes west. The wind being against us, we had made but little way. In the afternoon we stood inshore and fetched close under the Cavaliers, from which islands the main trends west by north. Several canoes put off and followed us, but a light breeze springing up, I did not choose to wait for them. I kept standing to the west-northwest and northwest till the next morning, 10 o'clock, when I tacked and stood in for the shore, from which we were about 5 leagues distant. At noon the westernmost land in sight bore west by south, and was about 4 leagues distant. In the afternoon we had a gentle breeze to the west, which in the evening came to the south, and continuing so all night, by daylight brought us pretty well in with the land, 7 leagues to the westward of the Cavaliers, where we found a deep bay running in southwest by west and west-southwest, the bottom of which we could but just see, and there the land appeared to be low and level. To this bay, which I called Doubtless Bay, the entrance is formed by 2 points, which lie west-northwest and east-southeast, and are 5 miles distant from each other. The wind not permitting us to look in here, we steered for the westernmost land in sight, which bore from us west-northwest about 3 leagues, but before we got the length of it, it fell calm. While we lay becalmed, several canoes came off to us, but the people having heard of our guns, it was not without great difficulty that they were persuaded to come under our stern. After having bought some of their cloths, as well as their fish, we began to make inquiries concerning their country, and learnt, by the help of Tupia, that, at the distance of 3 days' rowing in their canoes, at a place called Murewenua, the land would take a short turn to the southward, and from thence extend no more to the west. This place we concluded to be the land discovered by Tasman, which he called Cape Maria Van Diemen, and finding these people so intelligent, we inquired farther if they knew of any country besides their own. They answered that they never had visited any other, but that their ancestors had told them that to the northwest by north or north-northwest there was a country of great extent called Ulimaroa, to which some people had sailed in a very large canoe, that only part of them returned and reported that after a passage of a month they had seen a country where the people eat hogs. Tupia then inquired whether these adventurers brought any hogs with them when they returned. They said no. Then, replied Tupia, your story is certainly false, for it cannot be believed that men who came back from an expedition without hogs had ever visited a country where hogs were to be procured. It is, however, remarkable, notwithstanding the shrewdness of Tupia's objection, that when they mentioned hogs, It was not by description but by name, calling them Bu-ah, the name which is given them in the South Sea Islands. But if the animal had been wholly unknown to them, and they had had no communication with people to whom it was known, they could not possibly have been acquainted with the name. About 10 o'clock at night, a breeze sprung up at west-northwest, with which we stood off north, and at noon the next day the Cavaliers bore southeast by east, distant 8 leagues. The entrance of Doubtless Bay, south by west, distant 3 leagues, and the northwest extremity of the land in sight, which we judged to be the main, bore northwest by west. Our latitude by observation was 34 degrees 44 minutes south. In the evening we found the variation to be 12 degrees 41 minutes east by the azimuth, and 12 degrees 40 minutes by the amplitude. Early in the morning we stood in with the land 7 leagues to the westward of Doubtless Bay, the bottom of which is not far distant from the bottom of another large bay which the shore forms at this place, being separated only by a low neck of land which juts out into a peninsula that I have called Knuckle Point. About the middle of this bay, which we called Sandy Bay, is a high mountain, standing upon a distant shore, to which I gave the name of Mount Camel. The latitude here is 34 degrees 51 minutes south, and longitude 186 degrees 50 minutes. We had 24 and 25 fathom water with a good bottom, but there seems to be nothing in this bay that can induce a ship to put into it, for the land about it is utterly barren and desolate, and except Mount Camel, the situation is low. The soil appears to be nothing but white sand, thrown up in low, irregular hills and narrow ridges, lying parallel with the shore. But barren and desolate as this place is, it is not without inhabitants. We saw one village on the west side of Mount Camel, and another on the east side. We saw also 5 canoes full of people, who pulled after the ship, but could not come up with us. At 9 o'clock we tacked and stood to the northward, and at noon the Cavaliers bore southeast by east, distant 13 leagues, the north extremity of the land in sight, making like an island, bore northwest 1/4 north, distant 9 leagues, and Mount Camel bore southwest by south, distant 6 leagues. The wind being contrary, we kept plying northward till 5 o'clock in the evening of the 12th, when, having made very little way, we tacked and stood to the northeast, being 2 leagues to the northward of Mount Camel, and about 1.5 miles from the shore, in which situation we had 22 fathom water. At 10 it began to blow and rain, which brought us under double reefed topsails. At 12 we tacked and stood to the westward till 7 the next morning, when we tacked and stood again to the northeast, being about 1 mile to windward of the place where we tacked last night. Soon after it blew very hard north-northwest, with heavy squalls and much rain, which brought us under our courses, and split the main topsail, so that we were obliged to unbend it and bend another. At 10 it became more moderate, and we set the topsails double reefed. At noon, having strong gales and heavy weather, we tacked and stood to the westward, and had no land in sight for the first time since we had been upon this coast. We had now strong gales at west and west-southwest, and at half an hour past 3 we tacked and stood to the northward. Soon after, a small island lying off Knuckle Point bore south 1/2 west, distant 1/2 league. In the evening, having split the fore and mizzen topsails, we brought the ship under her courses, and at midnight we wore and stood to the southward till 5 in the morning, when we tacked and stood to the northwest and saw land bearing south at the distance of 8 or 9 leagues. By this we discovered that we had fallen much to the leeward since yesterday morning. At noon our latitude by observation was 34 degrees 6 minutes south, and the same land which we had seen before to the northwest now bore southwest, and appeared to be the northern extremity of the country. We had a large swell rolling in from the westward, and, therefore, concluded that we were not covered by any land in that quarter. At 8 in the evening we tacked and stood to the westward, with as much sail as we could bear, and at noon the next day we were in latitude 34 degrees 10 minutes, longitude 185 degrees 45 minutes west, and by estimation about 17 leagues from the land, notwithstanding our utmost endeavours to keep in with it. On the 16th, at 6 in the morning, we saw land from the masthead bearing south-southwest, and at noon it bore south by west, distant 14 leagues. While we were standing in for the shore, we sounded several times, but had no ground with 90 fathom. At 8 we tacked in 108 fathom at about 3 or 4 miles from the shore, which was the same point of land that we had to the northwest before we were blown off. At noon it bore southwest, distant about 3 miles. Mount Camel bore south by east, distant about 11 leagues, and the westernmost land in sight bore south 75 degrees west. The latitude by observation was 34 degrees 20 minutes south. At 4 o'clock we tacked and stood inshore, in doing which we met with a strong rippling, and the ship fell fast to leeward, which we imputed to a current setting east. At 8 we tacked and stood off again till 8 the next morning, when we tacked and stood in, being about 10 leagues from the land. At noon the point of land which we were near the day before bore south-southwest, distant 5 leagues. The wind still continued at west, and at 7 o'clock we tacked in 35 fathom, when the point of land which has been mentioned before bore northwest by north, distant 4 or 5 miles, so that we had not gained 1 inch to windward the last 24 hours, which confirmed our opinion that there was a current to the eastward. The point of land I called North Cape, it being the northern extremity of this country. It lies in latitude 34 degrees 22 minutes south, longitude 186 degrees 55 minutes west, and 31 leagues distant from Cape Brett, in the direction of north 63 degrees west. It forms the north point of Sandy Bay, and is a peninsula jutting out northeast about 2 miles, and terminating in a bluff head that is flat at the top. The isthmus which joins this head to the mainland is very low, and for that reason the land of the Cape, from several situations, has the appearance of an island. It is still more remarkable when it is seen from the southward, by the appearance of a high round island at the southeast point of the Cape, but this also is a deception, for what appears to be an island is a round hill joined to the Cape by a low narrow neck of land. Upon the Cape we saw a hippa or village and a few inhabitants, and on the southeast side of it there appears to be anchorage and good shelter from the southwest and northwest winds. We continued to stand off and on, making northwest till noon on the 21st, when North Cape bore south 39 degrees east, distant 38 leagues. Our situation varied only a few leagues till the 23rd, when, about 7 o'clock in the evening, we saw land from the masthead, bearing south a half east. At 11 the next morning we saw it again, bearing south-southeast at the distance of 8 leagues. We now stood to the southwest, and at 4 o'clock the land bore southeast by south, distant 4 leagues, and proved to be a small island, with other islands or rocks still smaller, lying off the southwest end of it, and another lying off the northeast end, which were discovered by Tasman and called the Three Kings. The principal island lies in latitude 34 degrees 12 minutes south, longitude 187 degrees 48 minutes west, and distant 14 or 15 leagues from North Cape in the direction of west 14 degrees north. At midnight we tacked and stood to the northeast till 6 the next morning, which was Christmas Day, when we tacked and stood to the southward. At noon the Three Kings bore east 8 degrees north, distant 5 or 6 leagues. The variation this morning by the azimuth was 11 degrees 25 minutes east. On the 26th we stood to the southward close upon a wind, and at noon were in latitude 35 degrees 10 minutes south, longitude 188 degrees 20 minutes west, the Three Kings bearing north 26 degrees west, distant 22 leagues. In this situation we had no land in sight, and yet by observation we were in the latitude of the Bay of Islands, and by my reckoning but 20 leagues to the westward of North Cape, from whence it appears that the northern part of this island is very narrow, for otherwise we must have seen some part of the west side of it. We stood to the southward till 12 at night, and then tacked and stood to the northward. At 4 o'clock in the morning the wind freshened, and at 9 blew a storm, so that we were obliged to bring the ship to under her mainsail. Our course made good between noon this day and yesterday was south-southwest a half west, distance 11 miles. The Three Kings bore north 27 degrees east, distant 77 miles. The gale continued all this day until 2 the next morning, when it fell and began to veer to the southward and southwest, where it fixed about 4, when we made sail and steered east in for the land, under the foresail and mainsail, but the wind then rising, and by 8 o'clock being increased to a hurricane, with a prodigious sea, we were obliged to take in the mainsail. We then wore the ship, and brought her to with her head to the northwest. At noon the gale was somewhat abated, but we had still heavy squalls. Our course made good this day was north a little easterly, 29 miles. Latitude by account 34 degrees 50 minutes south, longitude 188 degrees 27 minutes west. The Three Kings bore north 41 degrees east, distant 52 miles. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the wind being at southwest and southwest by west, with hard squalls, we wore and lay on the other tack, and at 6 the next morning spread more sail. Our course and distance since yesterday was east by north 29 miles. In the afternoon we had hard squalls at southwest, and at 8 in the evening wore and stood to the northwest till 5 the next morning, and then wore and stood to the southeast. At 6 we saw the land bearing northeast, distant about 6 leagues, which we judged to be Cape Maria Van Diemen, and which corresponded with the account that had been given of it by the Indians. At midnight we wore and stood to the southeast, and on the next day at noon Cape Maria Van Diemen bore northeast by north, distant about 5 leagues. At 7 in the evening we tacked and stood to the westward, with a moderate breeze at southwest by south and southwest. Mount Camel then bore north 83 degrees east, and the northernmost land, or Cape Maria Van Diemen, north by west. We were now distant from the nearest land about 3 leagues, where we had something more than 40 fathom water, and it must be remarked that Mount Camel, which when seen from the other side did not seem to be more than 1 mile from the sea, seemed to be but little more when seen from this side, which is a demonstration that the land here cannot be more than 2 or 3 miles broad, or from sea to sea. At 6 o'clock in the morning of January the 1st, 1770, being New Year's Day, we tacked and stood to the eastward, the 3 Kings bearing northwest by north. At noon we tacked again and stood to the westward, being in latitude 34 degrees 37 minutes south, the 3 Kings bearing northwest by north at the distance of 10 or 11 leagues, and Cape Maria Van Diemen north 31 degrees east, distant about 4 leagues and a half. In this situation we had 54 fathom water. During this part of our navigation, 2 particulars are very remarkable. In latitude 35 degrees south and in the midst of summer, I met with a gale of wind, which for its strength and continuance was such as I had scarcely ever been in before, and we were 3 weeks in getting 10 leagues to the westward, and 5 weeks in getting 50 leagues, for at this time it was so long since we passed Cape Brett. During the gale we were happily at a considerable distance from the land, otherwise it is highly probable that we should never have returned to relate our adventures. At 5 o'clock in the evening, having a fresh breeze to the westward, we tacked and stood to the southward. At this time North Cape bore east 3/4 north, and just open of a point that lies 3 leagues west by north from it. This cape, as I have observed before, is the northernmost extremity of this country, and at the easternmost point of a peninsula, which runs out northwest and northwest by north 17 or 18 leagues, and of which Cape Maria Van Diemen is the westernmost point. Cape Maria lies in latitude 34 degrees 30 minutes south, longitude 187 degrees 18 minutes west, and from this point the land trends away southeast by south and southeast beyond Mount Camel, and is everywhere a barren shore consisting of banks of white sand. On the 2nd at noon we were in latitude 35 degrees 17 minutes south, and Cape Maria bore north, distant about 16 leagues, as near as we could guess, for we had no land in sight and did not dare to go nearer, as a fresh gale blew right on shore with a rolling sea. The wind continued at west-southwest and southwest with frequent squalls. In the evening we shortened sail and at midnight tacked, and made a trip to the northwest till 2 in the morning, when we wore and stood to the southward. At break of day we made sail and edged away in order to make land, and at 10 o'clock we saw it bearing northwest. It appeared to be high, and at noon extended from north to east-northeast, distant by estimation 8 or 10 leagues. Cape Maria then bore north 2 degrees 30 minutes west, distant 33 leagues. Our latitude by observation was 36 degrees 2 minutes south. About 7 o'clock in the evening we were within 6 leagues of it, but having a fresh gale upon it, with a rolling sea, we hauled our wind to the southeast and kept on that course close upon the wind all night, sounding several times, but having no ground with 100 and 110 fathom. At 8 o'clock the next morning, we were about 5 leagues from the land, and off a place which lies in latitude 36 degrees 25 minutes, and had the appearance of a bay or inlet. It bore east, and in order to see more of it, we kept on our course till 11 o'clock, when we were not more than 3 leagues from it, and then discovered that it was neither inlet nor bay, but a tract of low land, bounded by higher lands on each side, which produced the deception. At this time we tacked and stood to the northwest, and at noon the land was not distant more than 3 or 4 leagues. We were now in latitude 36 degrees 31 minutes south, longitude 185 degrees 50 minutes west. Cape Maria bore north 25 degrees west, distant 44 leagues and a half, so that the coast must be almost straight in the direction of south-southeast 3/4 east and north-northwest 3/4 west nearly. In about latitude 35 degrees 45 minutes is some high land adjoining to the sea, to the southward of which the shore is also high, and has the most desolate and inhospitable appearance that can be imagined. Nothing is to be seen but hills of sand, on which there is scarcely a blade of verdure, and a vast sea, impelled by the westerly winds breaking upon it in a dreadful surf, renders it not only forlorn but frightful, complicating the idea of danger with desolation, and impressing the mind at once with a sense of misery and death. From this place I steered to the northward, resolving never more to come within the same distance of the coast, except the wind should be very favourable indeed. I stood under a fresh sail all the day, hoping to get an offing by the next noon, and we made good a course of 102 miles, north 38 degrees west. Our latitude by observation was 35 degrees 10 minutes south, and Cape Maria bore north 10 degrees east, distance 41 miles. In the night, the wind shifted from southwest by south to south and blew fresh. Our course to the noon of the 5th was north 75 degrees west, distance 8 miles. At daybreak on the 6th we saw the land which we took to be Cape Maria, bearing north-northeast, distant 8 or 9 leagues, and on the 7th in the afternoon the land bore east, and some time after we discovered a turtle upon the water, but being awake it dived instantly, so that we could not take it. At noon the high land, which has just been mentioned, extended from north to east at the distance of 5 or 6 leagues, and in 2 places a flat gave it the appearance of a bay or inlet. The course that we made good the last 24 hours was south 33 degrees east, 53 miles. Cape Maria bearing north 25 degrees west, distant 30 leagues. We sailed within sight of land all this day, with gentle gales between the northeast and northwest, and by the next noon had sailed 69 miles in the direction of south 37 degrees east. Our latitude by observation was 36 degrees 39 minutes south. The land which on the 4th we had taken for a bay now bore northeast by north, distant 5 leagues and a half, and Cape Maria north 29 degrees west, 47 leagues. On the 9th we continued a southeast course until 8 o'clock in the evening, having run 7 leagues since noon, with the wind at north-northeast and north, and being within 3 or 4 leagues of the land, which appeared to be low and sandy. I then steered southeast by south in a direction parallel with the coast, having from 48 to 34 fathom water with a black sandy bottom. At daybreak the next morning we found ourselves between 2 and 3 leagues from the land, which began to have a better appearance, rising in gentle slopes and being covered with trees and herbage. We saw a smoke and a few houses, but it appeared to be but thinly inhabited. At 7 o'clock we steered south by east and afterwards south by west, the land lying in that direction. At 9 we were abreast of a point which rises with an easy ascent from the sea to a considerable height. This point, which lies in latitude 37 degrees 43 minutes, I named Woody Head. About 11 miles from this head, in the direction of southwest to half-west, lies a very small island, upon which we saw a great number of gannets, and which we therefore called Gannet Island. At noon a high craggy point bore east-northeast, distant about 1.5 leagues, to which I gave the name of Albatross Point. It lies in latitude 38 degrees 4 minutes south, longitude 184 degrees 42 minutes west, and is distant 7 leagues in the direction of south 17 degrees west from Woody Head. On the north side of this point the shore forms a bay in which there appears to be anchorage and shelter for shipping. Our course and distance for the last 24 hours was south 37 degrees east, 69 miles. And at noon this day Cape Maria bore north 30 degrees west, distant 82 leagues. Between 12 and 1, the wind shifted at once from north-northeast to south-southwest, with which we stood to the westward till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and then tacked and stood again inshore till 7, when we tacked again and stood to the westward, having but little wind. At this time Albatross Point bore northeast, distant near 2 leagues, and the southernmost land in sight bore south-southwest to half-west, being a very high mountain, and in appearance greatly resembling the peak of Tenerife. In this situation we had 30 fathom water, and having but little wind all night, we tacked about 4 in the morning and stood in for the shore. Soon after it fell calm, and being in 42 fathom water, the people caught a few sea bream. At 11 a light breeze sprung up from the west, and we made sail to the southward. We continued to steer south by west and south-southwest along the shore, at the distance of about 4 leagues, with gentle breezes from between northwest and north-northeast. At 7 in the evening we saw the top of the peak to the southward, above the clouds, which concealed it below. And at this time the southernmost land in sight bore south by west. The variation, by several azimuths which were taken both in the morning and the evening, appeared to be 14 degrees 15 minutes easterly. At noon on the 12th we were distant about 3 leagues from the shore, which lies under the peak, but the peak itself was wholly concealed by clouds. We judged it to bear about south-southeast, and some very remarkable peaked islands, which lay under the shore, bore east-southeast, distant 3 or 4 leagues. At 7 in the evening we sounded and had 42 fathom, being distant from the shore between 2 and 3 leagues. We judged the peak to bear east, and after it was dark we saw fires upon the shore. At 5 o'clock in the morning we saw for a few minutes the summit of the peak towering above the clouds and covered with snow. It now bore northeast, It lies in latitude 39 degrees 16 minutes south, longitude 185 degrees 15 minutes west, and I named it Mount Egmont in honour of the Earl. It seems to have a large base and to rise with a gradual ascent. It lies near the sea and is surrounded by a flat country of a pleasant appearance, being clothed with verdure and wood, which renders it the more conspicuous, and the shore under it forms a large cape, which I have named Cape Egmont. It lies south-southwest a half west, 27 leagues distant from Albatross Point, and on the north side of it are two small islands, which lie near a remarkable point on the main that rises to a considerable height in the form of a sugar loaf. To the southward of the cape, the land trends away southeast by east and south-southeast, and seems to be everywhere a bold shore. At noon, Cape Egmont bore about northeast, and in this direction, at about 4 leagues from the shore, we had 40 fathom of water. The wind during the rest of the day was from west to northwest by west, and we continued to steer along the shore south-southeast and southeast by east, keeping at the distance of between 2 or 3 leagues. At half an hour after 7, we had another transient view of Mount Edgecombe, which bore north 17 degrees west, distant about 10 leagues. At 5 the next morning we steered southeast by south, the coast inclining more southerly, and in about half an hour we saw land, bearing southwest by south, for which we hauled up. At noon the northwest extremity of the land in sight bore south 63 degrees west, and some high land, which had the appearance of an island lying under the main, bore south-southeast, distant 5 leagues. We were now in a bay, the bottom of which bearing south we could not see, though it was clear in that quarter. Our latitude by observation was 40 degrees 27 minutes south, longitude 184 degrees 39 minutes west. At 8 in the evening we were within 2 leagues of the land which we had discovered in the morning, having run 10 leagues since noon. The land, which then bore south 63 degrees west, now bore north 59 degrees west, at the distance of 7 or 8 leagues, and had the appearance of an island. Between this land and Cape Egmont lies the bay, the west side of which was our situation at this time, and the land here is of a considerable height and diversified by hill and valley. End of section 32. Section 33 of The First Voyage of James Cook, Volume 1 by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 6, Part 1. Transactions in Queen Charlotte's Sound. Passage through the strait which divides the 2 islands, and back to Cape Turnagain. Horrid custom of the inhabitants. Remarkable melody of birds. A visit to a heifer, and many other particulars. The shore at this place seemed to form several bays, into one of which I proposed to carry the ship, which was become very foul, in order to careen her, and at the same time repair some defects, and recruit our wood and water. With this view I kept plying on and off all night, having from 80 to 63 fathom. At daybreak the next morning I stood for an inlet which runs in southwest, and at 8 I got within the entrance which may be known by a reef of rocks stretching from the northwest point, and some rocky islands which lie off the southeast point. At 9 o'clock, there being little wind, and what there was being variable, we were carried by the tide or current within 2 cables' length of the northwest shore, where we had 54-fathom water, but by the help of our boats we got clear. Just at this time we saw a sea lion rise twice near the shore, the head of which exactly resembled that of the male which has been described in the account of Lord Anson's Voyage. We also saw some of the natives in a canoe cross the bay, and a village situated upon the point of an island which lies 7 or 8 miles within the entrance. At noon we were the length of this island, but there being little wind, the boats were ordered ahead to tow. About 1 o'clock we hauled close round the southwest end of the island, and the inhabitants of the village which was built upon it were immediately up in arms. About 2 we anchored in a very safe and convenient cove on the northwest side of the bay, and facing the southwest end of the island, in 11-fathom water, with soft ground, and moored with the stream anchor. We were about 4 long cannon shot distant from the village or hepa, from which 4 canoes were immediately dispatched, as we imagined, to reconnoitre, and, if they should find themselves able, to take us. The men were all well armed, and dressed nearly as they are represented in the figure published by Tasman. 2 corners of the cloth which they wrapped round the body were passed over the shoulders from behind, and being brought down to the upper edge of it before, were made fast to it just under the breast, but few or none had feathers in their hair. They rowed round the ship several times, with their usual tokens of menace and defiance, and at last began the assault by throwing some stones. Tupia expostulated with them, but apparently to very little purpose, and we began to fear that they would oblige us to fire at them, when a very old man in one of the boats expressed the desire of coming on board. We gladly encouraged him in his design. A rope was thrown into his canoe, and she was immediately alongside of the ship. The old man rose up and prepared to come up the ship's side, upon which all the rest expostulated with great vehemence against the attempt, and at last laid hold of him and held him back. He adhered, however, to his purpose with a calm but steady perseverance, and having at length disengaged himself, he came on board. We received him with all possible expressions of friendship and kindness, and after some time dismissed him, with many presents, to his companions. As soon as he was returned on board his canoe, the people in all the rest began to dance, but whether as a token of enmity or friendship we could not certainly determine, for we had seen them dance in a disposition both for peace and war. In a short time, however, they retired to their fort, and soon after I went on shore, with most of the gentlemen, at the bottom of the cove, abreast of the ship. We found a fine stream of excellent water, and wood in the greatest plenty, for the land here was one forest of vast extent. As we brought the seine with us, we hauled it once or twice, and with such success that we caught near 300 weight of fish of different sorts, which was equally distributed among the ship's company. At daybreak, while we were busy in careening the ship, 3 canoes came off to us, having on board above 100 men, besides several of their women, which we were pleased to see, as in general it is a sign of peace. But they soon afterwards became very troublesome, and gave us reason to apprehend some mischief from them to the people that were in our boats alongside the ship. While we were in this situation, the lungboat was sent ashore with some water casks, and some of the canoes attempting to follow her. We found it necessary to intimidate them by firing some small shot. We were at such a distance that it was impossible to hurt them, yet our reproof had its effect, and they desisted from the pursuit. They had some fish in their canoes, which they now offered to sell, and which, though it stunk, we consented to buy. For this purpose a man in a small boat was sent among them, and they traded for some time very fairly. At length, however, one of them, watching his opportunity, snatched at some paper which our market man held in his hand, and missing it, immediately put himself in a posture of defence, flourished his patu, and making show as if he was about to strike, some small shot were then fired at him from the ship, a few of which struck him upon the knee. This put an end to our trade, but the Indian still continued near the ship, rowing round her many times, and conversing with Tupia, chiefly concerning the traditions they had among them with respect to the antiquities of their country. To this subject they were led by the inquiries which Tupia had been directed to make, whether they had ever seen such a vessel as ours, or had ever heard that any such had been upon their coast. These inquiries were all answered in the negative, so that tradition has preserved among them no memorial of Tasman, though, by an observation made this day, we find that we are only 15 miles south of Murderers Bay, our latitude being 41 degrees 5 minutes 32 seconds, and Murderers Bay, according to his account, being 40 degrees 50 minutes. The women in these canoes and some of the men had a headdress which we had not before seen. It consisted of a bunch of black feathers, made up in a round form and tied upon the top of the head, which it entirely covered and made it twice as high to appearance as it was in reality. After dinner I went in the pinnace with Mr. Banks, Dr. Solander, Tupia, and some others into another cove about 2 miles distant from that in which the ship lay. In our way we saw something floating upon the water, which we took for a dead seal, but upon rowing up to it, found it to be the body of a woman, which, to all appearance, had been dead some days. We proceeded to our cove, where we went on shore and found a small family of Indians, who appeared to be greatly terrified at our approach, and all ran away except one. A conversation between this person and Tupia soon brought back the rest, except an old man and a child, who still kept aloof, but stood peeping at us from the woods. Of these people our curiosity naturally led us to inquire after the body of the woman, which we had seen floating upon the water, and they acquainted us by Tupia that she was a relation who had died a natural death, and that, according to their custom, they had tied a stone to the body and thrown it into the sea, which stone, they supposed, had, by some accident, become disengaged. This family, when we came on shore, was employed in dressing some provisions. The body of a dog was at this time buried in their oven, and many provision baskets stood near it. Having cast our eyes carelessly into one of these, as we passed it, we saw 2 bones pretty cleanly picked, which did not seem to be the bones of a dog, and which, upon a nearer examination, we discovered to be those of a human body. At this sight we were struck with horror, though it was only a confirmation of what we had heard many times since we arrived upon this coast. As we could have no doubt but the bones were human, neither could we have any doubt but that the flesh which covered them had been eaten. They were found in a provision basket. The flesh that remained appeared manifestly to have been dressed by fire, and in the gristles at the end were the marks of the teeth which had gnawed them. To put an end, however, to conjecture, founded upon circumstances and appearances, we directed Tupia to ask what bones they were, and the Indians, without the least hesitation, answered the bones of a man. They were then asked what was become of the flesh, and they replied that they had eaten it. But said Tupia, "Why did you not eat the body of the woman which we saw floating upon the water?" "The woman," said they, "died of disease. Besides, she was our relation, and we eat only the bodies of our enemies who are killed in battle." Upon inquiry who the man was whose bones we had found, they told us that about 5 days before, a boat belonging to their enemies came into the bay with many persons on board, and that this man was of the 7 whom they had killed. Though stronger evidence of this horrid practice prevailing among the inhabitants of this coast will scarcely be required, we have still stronger to give. One of us asked if they had any human bones with the flesh remaining upon them, and upon their answering us that all had been eaten, we affected to disbelieve that the bones were human, and said that they were the bones of a dog. Upon which one of the Indians, with some eagerness, took hold of his own forearm, and thrusting it towards us, said that the bone which Mr. Banks held in his hand had belonged to that part of the human body. At the same time, to convince us that the flesh had been eaten, he took hold of his own arm with his teeth, and made show of eating. He also bit and gnawed the bone which Mr. Banks had taken, drawing it through his mouth, and showing, by signs, that it had afforded a delicious repast. The bone was then returned to Mr. Banks, and he brought it away with him. Among the persons of this family there was a woman who had her arms, legs, and thighs frightfully cut in several places, and we were told that she had inflicted the wounds upon herself in token of her grief for the loss of her husband, who had been lately killed and eaten by their enemies, who had come from some place to the eastward, towards which the Indians pointed. The ship lay at the distance of somewhat less than a quarter of a mile from the shore, and in the morning we were awakened by the singing of the birds. The number was incredible, and they seemed to strain their throats in emulation of each other. This wild melody was infinitely superior to any that we had ever heard of the same kind. It seemed to be like small bells, most exquisitely tuned, and perhaps the distance and the water between might be no small advantage to the sound. Upon inquiry, we were informed that the birds here always begin to sing about 2 hours after midnight, and continuing their music till sunrise, were, like our nightingales, silent the rest of the day. In the forenoon a small canoe came off from the Indian village to the ship, and among those that were in it was the old man who had first come on board at our arrival in the bay. As soon as it came alongside, Tupia renewed the conversation that had passed the day before, concerning their practice of eating human flesh, during which they repeated what they had told us already. "But," said Tupia, "where are the heads? Do you eat them too?" "Of the heads," said the old man, "we eat only the brains, and the next time I come I will bring some of them to convince you that what we have told you is truth." After some farther conversation between these people and Tupia, they told him that they expected their enemies to come very shortly to revenge the death of the 7 men whom they had killed and eaten. On the 18th, the Indians were more quiet than usual. No canoe came near the ship, nor did we see one of them moving on the shore, their fishing and other usual occupations being totally suspended. We thought they expected an attack on this day, and, therefore, attended more diligently to what passed on shore, but we saw nothing to gratify our curiosity. After breakfast, we went out in the pinnace to take a view of the bay, which was of vast extent, and consisted of numberless small harbours and coves in every direction. We confined our excursion, however, to the western side, and the country being an impenetrable forest where we landed, we could see nothing worthy of notice. We killed, however, a good number of shags, which we saw sitting upon their nests in the trees, and which, whether roasted or stewed, we considered as very good provision. As we were returning, we saw a single man in a canoe fishing. We rowed up to him, and, to our great surprise, he took not the least notice of us, but even when we were alongside of him, continued to follow his occupation, without adverting to us any more than if we had been invisible. He did not, however, appear to be either sullen or stupid. We requested him to draw up his net, that we might examine it, and he readily complied. It was of a circular form, extended by 2 hoops, and about 7 or 8 feet in diameter. The top was open, and sea ears were fastened to the bottom as a bait. This he let down so as to lie upon the ground, and when he thought fish enough were assembled over it, he drew it up by a very gentle and even motion, so that the fish rose with it, scarcely sensible that they were lifted, till they came very near the surface of the water, and then were brought out in the net by a sudden jerk. By this simple method he had caught abundance of fish, and, indeed, they are so plenty in this bay that the catching them requires neither much labour nor art. This day some of our people found in the skirts of the wood, near a hole or oven, 3 human hip bones, which they brought on board, a farther proof that these people eat human flesh. Mr. Monkhouse, our surgeon, also brought on board, from a place where he saw many deserted houses, the hair of a man's head, which he had found, among many other things, tied up to the branches of trees. In the morning of the 19th, we set up the armourer's forge to repair the braces of the tiller and other ironwork, all hands on board being still busy in careening and other necessary operations about the vessel. This day some Indians came on board from another part of the bay, where they said there was a town which we had not seen. They brought plenty of fish, which they sold for nails, having now acquired some notion of their use, and in this traffic no unfair practice was attempted. In the morning of the 20th, our old man kept his promise, and brought on board 4 of the heads of the 7 people who had been so much the subject of our inquiries. The hair and flesh were entire, but we perceived that the brains had been extracted. The flesh was soft, but had by some method been preserved from putrefaction, for it had no disagreeable smell. Mr. Banks purchased one of them, but they sold it with great reluctance, and could not by any means be prevailed upon to part with a second. Probably they may be preserved as trophies like the scalps in America and the jawbones in the islands of the South Seas. Upon examining the head which had been bought by Mr. Banks, we perceived that it had received a blow upon the temples, which had fractured the skull. This day we made another excursion in the pinnace to survey the bay, but we found no flat large enough for a potato garden, nor could we discover the least appearance of cultivation. We met not a single Indian, but found an excellent harbour, and about 8 o'clock in the evening returned on board the ship. On the 21st, Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander went a-fishing with hook and line, and caught an immense quantity everywhere upon the rocks, in between 4 and 5 fathom water. The seine was hauled every night, and seldom failed to supply the whole ship's company with as much fish as they could eat. This day all the people had leave to go on shore at the watering place, and divert themselves as they should think proper. In the morning of the 22nd I set out again in the pinnace, accompanied by Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander, with the design to examine the head of the inlet, but, after rowing about 4 or 5 leagues without so much as coming in sight of it, the wind being contrary, and the day half spent, we went on shore on the south-east side to try what might be discovered from the hills. Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander immediately employed themselves in botanizing near the beach, and I, taking a seaman with me, ascended one of the hills. When I reached the summit, I found a view of the inlet intercepted by hills, which in that direction rose still higher, and which were rendered inaccessible by impenetrable woods. I was, however, abundantly compensated for my labour, for I saw the sea on the eastern side of the country, and a passage leading from it to that on the west, a little to the eastward of the entrance of the inlet where the ship now lay. The mainland, which lay on the south-east of this inlet, appeared to be a narrow ridge of very high hills, and to form part of the southwest side of the strait. The land on the opposite side appeared to trend away east as far as the eye could reach, and to the southeast there appeared to be an opening to the sea, which washed the eastern coast. On the east side of the inlet also I saw some islands which I had before taken to be part of the mainland. Having made this discovery, I descended the hill, and as soon as we had taken some refreshment, we set out on our return to the ship. In our way we examined the harbours and coves which lie behind the islands that I had discovered from the hill, and in this route we saw an old village, in which there were many houses that seemed to have been long deserted. We also saw another village which was inhabited, but the day was too far spent for us to visit it, and we therefore made the best of our way to the ship, which we reached between 8 and 9 o'clock at night. The 23rd I employed in carrying on a survey of the place, and upon one of the islands where I landed, I saw many houses which seemed to have been long deserted, and no appearance of any inhabitant. On the 24th, we went to visit our friends at the Hipa or village on the point of the island near the ship's station, who had come off to us on our first arrival in the bay. They received us with the utmost confidence and civility, showing us every part of their habitations, which were commodious and neat. The island or rock on which this town is situated is divided from the main by a breach or fissure so narrow that a man might almost leap from one to the other. The sides of it are everywhere so steep as to render the artificial fortification of these people almost unnecessary. There was, however, one slight palisade and one small fighting stage, towards that part of the rock where access was least difficult. The people here brought us out several human bones, the flesh of which they had eaten, and offered them for sale, for the curiosity of those among us who had purchased them as memorials of the horrid practice which many, notwithstanding the reports of travellers, have professed not to believe, had rendered them a kind of article of trade. In one part of this village we observed, not without some surprise, a cross exactly like that of a crucifix. It was adorned with feathers, and upon our inquiring for what purpose it had been set up, we were told that it was a monument for a man who was dead. We had before understood that their dead were not buried, but thrown into the sea. But to our inquiry how the body of the man had been disposed of, to whose memory this cross had been erected, they refused to answer. When we left these people, we went to the other end of the island, and there, taking water, crossed over to the main, where we saw several houses, but no inhabitants, except a few in some straggling canoes that seemed to be fishing. After viewing this place, we returned on board the ship to dinner. During our visit to the Indians this day, Tupia being always of our party, they had been observed to be continually talking of guns and shooting people. For this subject of their conversation we could not at all account, and it had so much engaged our attention that we talked of it all the way back, and even after we got on board the ship. We had perplexed ourselves with various conjectures, which were all given up in their turn. But now we learnt that on the 21st one of our officers, upon pretence of going out to fish, had rowed up to the Hippa, and that 2 or 3 canoes coming off towards his boat, his fears suggested that an attack was intended, in consequence of which 3 muskets were fired, 1 with small shot and 2 with ball, at the Indians, who retired with the utmost precipitation, having probably come out with friendly intentions. For such their behaviour both before and afterwards expressed, and having no reason to expect such treatment from people who had always behaved to them not only with humanity but kindness, and to whom they were not conscious of having given offence. On the 25th I made another excursion along the coast, in the pinnace, towards the mouth of the inlet, accompanied by Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander, and going on shore at a little cove to shoot shags, we fell in with a large family of Indians, whose custom it is to disperse themselves among the different creeks and coves, where fish is to be procured in the greatest plenty, leaving a few only in the Hippa, to which the rest repair in times of danger. Some of these people came out a good way to meet us, and gave us an invitation to go with them to the rest of their party, which we readily accepted. We found a company of about 30 men, women, and children, who received us with all possible demonstrations of friendship. We distributed among them a few ribbons and beads, and in return received the kisses and embraces of both sexes, both young and old. They gave us also some fish, and after a little time we returned, much pleased with our new acquaintance. In the morning of the 26th I went out again in the boat with Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander, and entered one of the bays, which lie on the east side of the inlet, in order to get another sight of the strait which passed between the eastern and western seas. For this purpose, having landed at a convenient place, we climbed a hill of a very considerable height, from which we had a full view of it, with the land on the opposite shore, which we judged to be about 4 leagues distant. But as it was hazy in the horizon, we could not see far to the south east. I resolved, however, to search the passage with the ship as soon as I should put to sea. Upon the top of this hill we found a parcel of loose stones, with which we erected a pyramid, and left in it some musket balls, small shot, beads, and other things which we happened to have about us, that were likely to stand the test of time, and, not being of Indian workmanship, would convince any European who should come to the place and pull it down that other natives of Europe had been there before him. When this was done, we descended the hill and made a comfortable meal of the shags and fish which our guns and lines had procured us, and which were dressed by the boat's crew in a place that we had appointed. In this place we found another Indian family, who received us as usual with strong expressions of kindness and pleasure, showing us where to procure water, and doing us such other good offices as were in their power. From this place we went to the town of which the Indians had told us, who visited us on the 19th. This, like that which we had seen before, was built upon a small island or rock, so difficult of access that we gratified our curiosity at the risk of our necks. The Indians here also received us with open arms, carried us to every part of the place, and showed us all that it contained. This town, like the other, consisted of between 80 and 100 houses, and had only one fighting stage. We happened to have with us a few nails and ribbons, and some paper, with which our guests were so gratified that at our coming away they filled our boat with dried fish, of which we perceived they had laid up great quantities. The 27th and 28th were spent in refitting the ship for the sea, fixing a transom for the tiller, getting stones on board to put into the bottom of the bread room, to bring the ship more by the stern, in repairing the casks and catching fish. End of section 33. Section 34 of the First Voyage of James Cook, Volume 1 by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 2, Chapter 6, Part 2. Transactions in Queen Charlotte's Sound, passage through the strait which divides the two islands and back to Cape Turnagain, horrid custom of the inhabitants, remarkable melody of birds, a visit to a heifer, and many other particulars. Continued. On the 29th we received a visit from our old man, whose name we found to be Tapara, and 3 other natives with whom Tapia had much conversation. The old man told us that one of the men who had been fired upon by the officer who had visited their hippa under pretence of fishing was dead. But to my great comfort I afterwards discovered that this report was not true, and that if Tapara's discourses were taken literally, they would frequently lead us into mistakes. Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander were several times on shore during the last 2 or 3 days, not without success, but greatly circumscribed in their walks by climbers of a most luxuriant growth, which were so interwoven together as to fill up the space between the trees about which they grew, and render the woods altogether impassable. This day also I went on shore again myself, upon the western point of the inlet, and from a hill of considerable height I had a view of the coast to the northwest. The farthest land I could see in that quarter was an island which has been mentioned before, at the distance of about 10 leagues, lying not far from the main. Between this island and the place where I stood, I discovered, close under the shore, several other islands, forming many bays, in which there appeared to be good anchorage for shipping. After I had set off the different points for my survey, I erected another pile of stones, in which I left a piece of silver coin, with some musket balls and beads, and a piece of an old pendant flying on the top. In my return to the ship, I made a visit to several of the natives whom I saw along the shore, and purchased a small quantity of fish. On the 30th, early in the morning, I sent a boat to one of the islands for celery, and while the people were gathering it, about 20 of the natives, men, women, and children, landed near some empty huts. As soon as they were on shore, 5 or 6 of the women sat down upon the ground together, and began to cut their legs, arms, and faces with shells and sharp pieces of talc or jasper in a terrible manner. Our people understood that their husbands had lately been killed by their enemies, but while they were performing this horrid ceremony, the men set about repairing the huts with the utmost negligence and unconcern. The carpenter having prepared 2 posts to be left as memorials of our having visited this place, I ordered them to be inscribed with the ship's name and the year and month. One of them I set up at the watering place, hoisting the Union flag upon the top of it, and the other I carried over to the island that lies nearest to the sea, called by the natives Motuara. I went first to the village or Hippa, accompanied by Mr. Monkhouse and Tupia, where I met with our old man, and told him and several others, by means of Tupia, that we were come to set up a mark upon the island, in order to show to any other ship which should happen to come thither that we had been there before. To this they readily consented, and promised that they never would pull it down. I then gave something to every one present, and to the old man I gave a silver 3d, dated 1736, and some spike nails, with the king's broad arrow cut deep upon them, things which I thought most likely to remain long among them. I then took the post to the highest part of the island, and after fixing it firmly in the ground, I hoisted upon it the Union flag, and honoured this inlet with the name of Queen Charlotte's Sound, at the same time taking formal possession of this in the adjacent country, in the name and for the use of His Majesty King George III. We then drank a bottle of wine to Her Majesty's health, and gave the bottle to the old man who had attended us up the hill, and who was mightily delighted with his present. While the post was setting up, we inquired of the old man concerning the passage into the Eastern Sea, the existence of which he confirmed, and then asked him about the land to the southwest of the strait, where we were then situated. This land, he said, consisted of 2 wenuas or islands, which may be circumnavigated in a few days, and which he called Povi Poen Am Mu. The literal translation of this word is the water of green talc, and probably if we had understood him better, we should have found that Tovi Poenamu was the name of some particular place where they got the green talc or stone of which they make their ornaments and tools, and not a general name for the whole southern district. He said there was also a 3rd Wenua on the east side of the strait, the circumnavigation of which would take up many moons. This he called Iahaino Maua, and to the land on the borders of the strait he gave the name of Tierra Witta. Having set up our post and procured this intelligence, we returned on board the ship and brought the old man with us, who was attended by his canoe, in which, after dinner, he returned home. On the 31st, having completed our wooding and filled all our water casks, I sent out 2 parties, one to cut and make brooms, and another to catch fish. In the evening we had a strong gale from the northwest, with such a heavy rain that our little wild musicians on shore suspended their song, which till now we had constantly heard during the night, with a pleasure which it was impossible to lose without regret. On the 1st the gale increased to a storm, with heavy gusts from the Highland, one of which broke the hawser that we had fastened to the shore, and obliged us to let go another anchor. Towards midnight the gale became more moderate, but the rain continued with such violence that the brook which had supplied us with water overflowed its banks, and carried away 10 small casks, which had been left there full of water, and, notwithstanding we searched the whole cove, we could never recover one of them. On the 3rd, as I intended to sail at the first opportunity, I went over to the Hipper on the east side of the Sound, and purchased a considerable quantity of split and half-dried fish for sea stores. The people here confirmed all that the old man had told us concerning the strait and the country, and about noon I took leave of them. Some of them seemed to be sorry and others glad that we were going. The fish which I had bought they sold freely, but there were some who showed manifest signs of disapprobation. As we returned to the ship, some of us made an excursion along the shore to the northward to traffic with the natives for a farther supply of fish, in which, however, they had no great success. In the evening we got everything off from the shore, as I intended to sail in the morning, but the wind would not permit. On the 4th, while we were waiting for a wind, we amused ourselves by fishing and gathering shells and seeds of various kinds, and early on the morning of the 5th we cast off the hawser, hove short on the bower, and carried the kedge anchor out, in order to warp the ship out of the cove, which having done, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we hove up the anchor and got under sail. But the wind soon failing, we were obliged to come to an anchor again a little above Motuara. When we were under sail, our old man, Tapara, came on board to take his leave of us, and as we were still desirous of making farther inquiries whether any memory of Tasman had been preserved among these people, Tupia was directed to ask him whether he had ever heard that such a vessel as ours had before visited the country. To this he replied in the negative, but said that his ancestors had told him there had once come to this place a small vessel from a distant country, called Ulimaroa, in which there were 4 men who, upon their coming on shore, were all killed. Upon being asked where this distant land lay, he pointed to the northward. Of Ulimaroa we had heard something before from the people about the Bay of Islands, who said that their ancestors had visited it, and Tupia had also talked to us of Ulimaroa, concerning which he had some confused traditionary notions, not very different from those of our old man, so that we could draw no certain conclusion from the accounts of either. Soon after the ship came to an anchor the second time, Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander went on shore to see if any gleanings of natural knowledge remained, and by accident fell in with the most agreeable Indian family they had seen, which afforded them a better opportunity of remarking the personal subordination among these people than had before offered. The principal persons were a widow and a pretty boy about 10 years old. The widow was mourning for her husband with tears of blood, according to their custom, and the child, by the death of its father, was become proprietor of the land where we had cut our wood. The mother and the son were sitting upon mats, and the rest of the family, to the number of 16 or 17 of both sexes, sat round them in the open air, for they did not appear to have any house or other shelter from the weather, the inclemencies of which custom has probably enabled them to endure without any lasting inconvenience. Their whole behaviour was affable, obliging, and unsuspicious. They presented each person with fish and a brand of fire to dress it, and pressed them many times to stay till the morning, which they would certainly have done if they had not expected the ship to sail, greatly regretting that they had not become acquainted with them sooner, as they made no doubt but that more knowledge of the manners and disposition of the inhabitants of this country would have been obtained from them in a day than they had yet been able to acquire during our whole stay upon the coast. On the 6th, about 6 o'clock in the morning, a light breeze sprung up at north, and we again got under sail, but the wind proving variable, we reached no farther than just without Motuara. In the afternoon, however, a more steady gale at north by west set us clear of the sound, which I shall now describe. The entrance of Queen Charlotte Sound is situated in latitude 41 degrees south, longitude 184 degrees 45 minutes west, and near the middle of the southwest side of the strait in which it lies. The land of the southeast head of the sound, called by the natives Koamaru, off which lie 2 small islands and some rocks, makes the narrowest part of the strait. From the northwest head, a reef of rocks runs out about 2 miles in the direction of northeast by north, part of which is above the water and part below. By this account of the heads, the sound will be sufficiently known. At the entrance it is 3 leagues broad, and lies in southwest by south, southwest and west southwest, at least 10 leagues, and is a collection of some of the finest harbours in the world, as will appear from the plan, which is laid down with all the accuracy that time and circumstances would admit. The land forming the harbour or cove in which we lay is called by the natives Totaranu. The harbour itself, which I called Ship Cove, is not inferior to any in the Sound, either for convenience or safety. It lies on the west side of the Sound, and is the southernmost of 3 coves that are situated within the island of Motuara, which bears east of it. Ship Cove may be entered either between Motuara and a long island called by the natives Hamote, or between Motuara and the western shore. In the last of these channels are 2 ledges of rocks, 3 fathom under water, which may easily be known by the seaweed that grows upon them. In sailing either in or out of the Sound with little wind, attention must be had to the tides, which flow about 9 or 10 o'clock at the full and change of the moon, and rise and fall between 7 and 8 feet perpendicularly. The flood comes in through the strait from the southeast and sets strongly over upon the northwest head, and the reef that lies off it. The ebb sets with still greater rapidity to the southeast over upon the rocks and islands that lie off the southeast head. The variation of the compass we found, from good observation, to be 13 degrees 5 minutes east. The land about this Sound, which is of such a height that we saw it at the distance of 20 leagues, consists wholly of high hills and deep valleys, well stored with a variety of excellent timber, fit for all purposes except masts, for which it is too hard and heavy. The sea abounds with a variety of fish, so that, without going out of the cove where we lay, we caught every day, with the seine and hooks and lines, a quantity sufficient to serve the whole ship's company, and along the shore we found plenty of shags, and a few other species of wild fowl, which those who have long lived upon salt provisions will not think despicable food. The number of inhabitants scarcely exceeds 400, and they live dispersed along the shores, where their food, consisting of fish and fern roots, is most easily procured, for we saw no cultivated ground. Upon any appearance of danger, they retire to their hippas or forts. In this situation we found them, and in this situation they continued for some time after our arrival. In comparison of the inhabitants of other parts of this country, they are poor, and their canoes are without ornament. The little traffic we had with them was wholly for fish, and indeed they had scarcely anything else to dispose of. They seemed, however, to have some knowledge of iron, which the inhabitants of some other parts had not, for they willingly took nails for their fish, and sometimes seemed to prefer it to everything else that we could offer, which had not always been the case. They were at first very fond of paper, but when they found that it was spoiled by being wet, they would not take it. Neither did they set much value upon the cloth of Tahiti, but English broadcloth and red kersey were in high estimation, which showed that they had sense enough to appreciate the commodities which we offered by their use, which is more than could be said of some of their neighbours, who made a much better appearance. Their dress has been mentioned already, particularly their large round headdresses of feathers, which were far from being unbecoming. As soon as we got out of the Sound, I stood over to the eastward, in order to get the strait well open before the tide of ebb came on. At 7 in the evening, the two small islands which lie off Cape Koamaru, the southeast head of Queen Charlotte's Sound, bore east, distant about 4 miles. At this time it was nearly calm, and the tide of ebb setting out, we were, in a very short time, carried by the rapidity of the stream close upon one of the islands, which was a rock rising almost perpendicularly out of the sea. We perceived our danger increase every moment, and had but one expedient to prevent our being dashed to pieces, the success of which a few minutes would determine. We were now within little more than a cable's length of the rock, and had more than 75 fathom water, but upon dropping an anchor and veering about 150 fathom of cable, the ship was happily brought up. This, however, would not have saved us, if the tide which set south by east had not, upon meeting with the island, changed its direction to southeast, and carried us beyond the first point. In this situation we were not above 2 cables' length from the rocks, and here we remained in the strength of the tide, which set to the southeast after the rate of at least 5 miles an hour, from a little after 7 till near midnight, when the tide abated and we began to heave. By 3 in the morning the anchor was at the bows, and having a light breeze at northwest, we made sail for the eastern shore. But the tide being against us, we made but little way. The wind, however, afterwards freshened and came to north and northeast, with which, and the tide of ebb, we were in a short time hurried through the narrowest part of the strait, and then stood away for the southernmost land we had in sight, which bore from us south by west. Over this land appeared a mountain of stupendous height, which was covered with snow. The narrowest part of the strait, through which we had been driven with such rapidity, lies between Cape Terra on the coast of Haina-o-Maui and Cape Koamaru. The distance between them I judged to be between 4 or 5 leagues, and, notwithstanding the tide, now its strength is known, may be passed without much danger. It is, however, safest to keep on the northeast shore, for on that side there appeared to be nothing to fear. But on the other shore there are not only the islands and rocks which lie off Cape Koamaru, but a reef of rocks stretching from these islands 6 or 7 miles to the southward, at the distance of 2 or 3 miles from the shore, which I had discovered from the hill when I took my second view of the strait from the east to the western sea. The length of the strait we had passed I shall not pretend to assign, but some judgment may be formed of it from a view of the chart. About 9 leagues north from Cape Terra and under the same shore, is a high and remarkable island, which may be distinctly seen from Queen Charlotte's Sound, from which it is distant about 6 or 7 leagues. This island, which was noticed when we passed it on the 14th of January, I have called Entry Isle. On the east side of Cape Terra the land trends away southeast by east about 8 leagues, where it ends in a point and is the southernmost land on Haina-o-Maui. To this point I have given the name of Cape Palliser, in honour of my worthy friend Captain Palliser. It lies in latitude 41 degrees 34 minutes south, longitude 183 degrees 58 minutes west, and bore from us this day at noon south 79 degrees east, distant about 13 leagues, the ship being then in the latitude of 41 degrees 27 minutes south. Koamaru at the same time bearing north a half east, distant 7 or 8 leagues. The southernmost land in sight bore south 16 degrees west and the snowy mountain southwest. At this time we were about 3 leagues from the shore and abreast of a deep bay or inlet, to which I gave the name of Cloudy Bay, and at the bottom of which there appeared low land covered with tall trees. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon we were abreast of the southernmost point of land that we had seen at noon, which I called Cape Campbell. It lies south by west, distant between 12 and 13 leagues from Cape Koamaru, in latitude 41 degrees 44 minutes south, longitude 183 degrees 45 minutes west, and with Cape Palliser forms the southern entrance of the strait, the distance between them being between 13 and 14 leagues, west by south and east by north. From this cape we steered along the shore southwest by south till 8 o'clock in the evening, when the wind died away. About half an hour afterwards, however, a fresh breeze sprung up at southwest, and I put the ship right before it. My reason for this was a notion which some of the officers had just started, that Haina-o-Maui was not an island, and that the land might stretch away to the southeast from between Cape Turnagain and Cape Palliser, there being a space of between 12 and 15 leagues that we had not seen. I had indeed the strongest conviction that they were mistaken, not only from what I had seen the first time I discovered the strait, but from many other concurrent testimonies, that the land in question was an island. But being resolved to leave no possibility of doubt with respect to an object of such importance, I took the opportunity of the wind shifting to stand eastward, and accordingly steered northeast by east all the night. At 9 o'clock in the morning we were abreast of Cape Palliser, and found the land trend away northeast towards Cape Turnagain, which I reckon to be distant about 26 leagues. However, as the weather was hazy, so as to prevent our seeing above 4 or 5 leagues, I still kept standing to the northeast with a light breeze at south, and at noon Cape Palliser bore north 72 degrees west, distant about 3 leagues. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 canoes came up to the ship with between 30 and 40 people on board, who had been pulling after us with great labour and perseverance for some time. They appeared to be more cleanly and a better class than any we had met with since we left the Bay of Islands, and their canoes were also distinguished by the same ornaments which we had seen upon the northerly part of the coast. They came on board with very little invitation, and their behaviour was courteous and friendly. Upon receiving presents from us, they made us presents in return, which had not been done by any of the natives that we had seen before. We soon perceived that our guests had heard of us, for as soon as they came on board, they asked for "wow," the name by which nails were known among the people with whom we had trafficked. But though they had heard of nails, it was plain they had seen none, for when nails were given them, they asked to peer what they were. The term "wow," indeed, conveyed to them the idea not of their quality, but only of their use, for it is the same by which they distinguish a tool, commonly made of bone, which they use both as an auger and a chisel. However, their knowing that we had "wow" to sell was a proof that their connections extended as far north as Cape Kidnappers, which was distant no less than 45 leagues, for that was the southernmost place on this side the coast where we had had any traffic with the natives. It is also probable that the little knowledge which the inhabitants of Queen Charlotte Sound had of iron, they obtained from their neighbours at Tierra Witta, for we had no reason to think that the inhabitants of any part of this coast had the least knowledge of iron or its use before we came among them, especially as, when it was first offered, they seemed to disregard it as of no value. We thought it probable that we were now once more in the territories of Teratu, but upon inquiring of these people, they said that he was not their king. After a short time they went away, much gratified with the presents that we had made them, and we pursued our course along the shore to the northeast till 11 o'clock the next morning. About this time, the weather happening to clear up, we saw Cape Turnagain bearing north by east a half east at the distance of about 7 leagues. I then called the officers upon deck and asked them whether they were not now satisfied that Maui was an island. They readily answered in the affirmative, and all doubts being now removed, we hauled our wind to the eastward. End of section 34. End of the first voyage of James Cook, Volume 1 by James Cook.